watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following: and by viewers like you.
Usually I speak at the United Nations. We give speeches there all the time at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And let's just say I'm not their favorite guy. And when I come into the chamber and sitting there about to give a speech, I am met with varying forms of hostility and nasty, very nasty stares. So to come here, Scott, and to be among dear friends, and getting an altogether different reception. It takes a little getting used to, but I like it. And I'm going to try to keep it with me when I go back to Geneva next week and fight the battles that are brewing there. The Human Rights Council used to be known as the Human Rights Commission. The name changed in 2006. The original commission was founded more than 60 years ago, in 1946, by Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, some of you may know Eleanor Roosevelt was a great humanitarian of the age. She was the first chairperson of the Human Rights Commission. She helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She was Mrs. Human Rights. She was also one of the great friends of Israel. She was the honorary chair of Youth Hadassah. She almost resigned when she thought the U.S. wouldn't recognize Israel during the debates in 1947, 1948. She was a great friend of Israel. René Cassin, who was the chief drafter of the Universal Declaration, was also a great friend of Israel. He was a disciple of General de Gaulle, and they broke when de Gaulle attacked Israel, most famously in 1967. De Gaulle broke with him. De Gaulle was also, René Cassin broke with de Gaulle. So the two great figures of human rights back at the beginning, right after the war was over, also happened to be great friends of Israel. The causes were synonymous. And regrettably today, 60 years later, it is seen as two contrary causes. If you're for human rights, you're against Israel. And if you're for Israel, you're seen as against human rights. And that is false. And that is false. And the two stories I want to tell you about tonight will illustrate, unfortunately, the dire situation in which we find ourselves and in which the human rights movement, especially at the UN, finds itself. Let's begin with the Goldstone Report. It's a 575-page report. I have it here. I'm not going to open it up and read it for you. I have mercy on you, but I brought it in case. I know there's always some smart people who have some tough questions, so I brought it here to have my homework prepared. But I want to just go through a few elements in the report, and then I want to talk to you about Durban too. Let's talk about the Goldstone Report. Really, I think there are three great myths on the Goldstone Report. One says that the mandate was changed. I mentioned there was this emergency session, and there was a pattern that these emergency sessions would have. The Human Rights Council. Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the commission. It existed for 60 years. By the end of its days, 50% of its resolutions, by the 1990s, by the year 2004, when I first came to Geneva, 50% of the resolutions were against Israel, and only a handful of other countries were condemned once. One agenda item for the whole world, one agenda item just against Israel. This was built into the system. And the UN recognized they needed to reform it. So they reformed it, called it the Human Rights Council in 2006. And since that time, it's now 80% against Israel. So welcome to the dawn of a new era, as someone hailed the new Human Rights Council back when it was created. So one element of this pathological obsession with attacking Israel, which, by the way, it's a zero-sum game. There's a limited amount of time and diplomatic resources that the diplomats have. And if they're talking about Israel, and they're cabling on Israel, and they're negotiating on how to condemn Israel, that is directly time that they are not talking about 1,300,000,000 people systematically persecuted in China who don't have any basic human rights, or the genocide in Sudan, or the situation in North Korea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is a direct consequence of, and it's deliberate. The countries who want to talk about Israel don't want to talk about how women are subjugated in Saudi Arabia, how journalists are jailed in Cuba, and that's why both of those countries and their allies are at the forefront of the anti-Israel exercise. And the pattern of emergency special sessions was, in this new council, that if you'll recall in 2006, in the summer of 2006, from Gaza, Palestinians crossed over the international line, attacked Israeli soldiers who were within Israel, kidnapped Gilad Shalit, who remains in captivity to this day. Human Rights Council convened an emergency session to condemn Israel for responding, said nothing about Hamas. A month or two later, Hezbollah attacked Israel in the north. Emergency session to condemn Israel for responding to Hezbollah, didn't say a word about Hezbollah's provocation, not a word. And so this was the pattern, and that's what we had a year ago. During Operation Cast Lead, after 8 years of Qassam rockets, thousands and thousands of Qassam rockets against the civilian population in Israel's south, Israel finally responded after imploring the UN to act, and after the UN failed to do a thing. UN didn't even give words, let alone physical action, let alone military action. Israel responded, and again, the same pattern, emergency session, condemned Israel, not a word about Hamas, breaking the ceasefire, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things they did was they created the Goldstone Report. They created a fact-finding mission. So they declared Israel guilty of massive violations. And then they said, let's create a fact-finding mission to document Israel's guilt. Operating paragraph 14 of Resolution S91 sets up a fact-finding mission to look only at Israel, not at Hamas, not at the Palestinians, not at Iran, which is funding and training and smuggling rockets into the Gaza Strip. And Israel is declared guilty in advance and set up a quote-unquote fact-finding mission to basically document Israel's guilt. So completely upside-down proceeding. And this was the norm. And that's what happened 1 year ago. And even countries that sometimes criticize Israel, some European countries, refused to support that resolution. Even Switzerland, which often votes to condemn Israel, refused to support that resolution. Now, Goldstone was appointed 3 months later, on April 3rd. So January 12th, the resolution was adopted. April 3rd, Goldstone was appointed. Goldstone said, and this is myth number one, we changed the mandate. The mandate was originally one-sided against Israel, but I changed the mandate. Myth number one. Myth number two was the membership. Goldstone said the members of the mission, there were 4 members of the fact-finding mission. Goldstone insisted time and again, the members are objective and impartial. Impartial is the word he kept on saying. A myth. Third, the Goldstone Report, the 575-page document that was released on the 15th of September and presented to the Human Rights Council on the 29th of September, and it's created so many headlines, nearly brought down the president of the Palestinian Authority, and has had many other repercussions, and we're really only in the beginning of the repercussions and consequences of the Goldstone Report. The myth that we're told, there are European states today that say that the Goldstone Report is a serious report. So even if they don't accept everything, it is a serious report. And we're told by Human Rights Watch, which is one of the leading non-governmental organizations in the world, based here in New York, that the report is credible and authoritative. And there have been dozens of press releases coming out from that organization to tell us that. Both are false. These are myths. The report is not serious and it is not credible. And let me go in reverse order and puncture these myths and just give you a few examples. I'll talk first about the report itself, the contents of the report. I want to read you a few examples. There are so many. Let me just read you a few. Briefly, what's in the report? The report, the gist of the report is the accusation that the senior leadership of the Israeli government at the time, 1 year ago, namely Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, the head of the Labour Party, Ehud Barak, and others in the government. So in the center-left, and left-wing parties, the peace camp in Israel sat down and deliberately plotted to target civilians and to terrorize civilians and to kill civilians. This is the gist of the Goldstone Report, that Tzipi Livni and her allies set out to deliberately kill civilians and destroy food infrastructure and destroy sewage facilities, etc., to target and traumatize and terrorize Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Yes, there are also references to things that Hamas may have done, but the gist of the report, if you read it, is unmistakably what I've just described. And let me give you a few examples about how the report works. The report is not a serious report. It is an entirely one-sided report. In the narrative that it uses, it goes into a whole history, which is egregiously anti-Israel from A to Z, in the language that it uses against Israel, and its methodology. Let me give you a few examples. Israel did not cooperate with the Goldstone Report. In my view, some people debate this. In my view, this was justified. Especially if you read the report, you will see, and some say if Israel had cooperated and provided information, the conclusions would have been different. In my view, this is incorrect. The flaws, if you want to be charitable, the Goldstone Report, are not a lack of information. It is a mental structure. And more information does not change a mental structure. And I believe that had Israel cooperated, they would have had a much harder time getting their allies and friends to oppose it in various fora. Let me tell you, walk you through some examples of what's in the report. So Israel did not cooperate. And part of that is because of where it came from. It came from the Human Rights Council, which is controlled by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Russia and Cuba. They control the Human Rights Council. And they are the ones responsible for 80% of the resolutions against Israel, all of these resolutions that legitimize terrorism. And the purpose of the fact-finding mission was nothing other than a political exercise to demonize Israel, wherein Israel's guilt was declared in advance. And Israel, in my view, was perfectly justified. As an attorney, I would not allow my client to participate in such a proceeding, to legitimize such a proceeding. And Israel did not cooperate. And so the result was that Goldstone and his members could have said, it would be one thing if Israel would cooperate, but since Israel's not, I'm not going to proceed. I can't really do a serious job here. That was not the conclusion. That was not the action that they took. Instead, they went to Gaza and they heard witnesses in Gaza. Gaza is controlled by Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist group. You cannot speak to an international fact-finding mission in Gaza without fear of reprisal from Hamas. Should you say something that will be unfavorable in their eyes. So obviously everything that was said by anyone to the mission was said effectively under duress. Nevertheless, the way the formula, and there's an attorney at the law firm of Wachtell Lipton in New York named Trevor Norwitz, and he wrote a magnificent analysis of the Goldstone Report, and he goes through some of these examples and looks at the methodology, and he notes that repeatedly in the report, the formula is the following. The mission collected evidence in Gaza through testimony or through things that the Hamas people showed them. They collected evidence. The mission that the evidence collected, the evidence that the mission collected said X. No evidence to the contrary was demonstrated because Israel, for perfectly valid reasons, as I described, did not cooperate. So we collected evidence saying X, namely Israel committed war crimes. No contrary evidence was provided. Therefore, on the information available to it, the mission finds X. And throughout the report of the 575 pages, these are the conclusions. Rather than saying, than providing some caution to the conclusions and saying, we really only heard from one side. That one side happened to be Hamas or controlled by Hamas. That's not the way the mission proceeded. They gave their conclusions as if they were firmly based and pretended to have established the truth and were not forthcoming that they had really only heard one side of the story. So that really is throughout the entire report. A second example of what's common in the report is failure to investigate critical facts. I'll give one example. it was widely reported during the war that the Hamas high command was situated in a hospital. For those who are not aware, this is Hamas's modus operandi, is to fight their warfare from civilian areas and to use ambulances and to use a hospital. And it was widely reported they were camped out in the Al-Shifa hospital. Now, the Goldstone mission says the following, quote, "The mission did not investigate the case of the Al-Shifa hospital and is not in a position to make any finding with regard to these allegations that Hamas was based there." Okay, they chose not to investigate it. And then, a paragraph later, they come to the following conclusion, quote, "On the basis of the investigations it has conducted, the mission did not find any evidence to support the allegations made by Israel that Hamas used medical facilities for cover." So they didn't investigate the fact that the high command was in the hospital, and then they came to a conclusion that based on everything they saw, there was no basis for Israel's claim. And this is, again, throughout the report. I'll give you one other example of something that's common in the report, is a double standard. There's a double standard that is practiced throughout the report in regard to statements made by Israeli leaders and statements made by Palestinian leaders. Let me give you a few examples of this. There was a statement by Eli Yishai, who's a minister at the time in the Israeli government, saying, giving a tough statement that we're really going to hit back the Palestinians very hard. For every rocket that they attack, we'll attack them in a very strong way. I have the quote here somewhere, but that was the gist of the statement. The kinds of statements that all political leaders, or many do, during a time of war. Perhaps it wasn't very prudent. The statement that he made was the kind of thing, again, that politicians and populist politicians will make in a time of war. I don't know if he said we're going to bomb 100 houses for every Israeli house that's hit, something along those lines. And the Goldstone Report says, aha, here we have this harsh statement by this Israeli leader, and therefore this is a proof that everything that Israel did during the war is deliberately intended to target civilians. So rather than say this is a statement by a politician and say that it's puffery by a politician, he said this is evidence that Israel deliberately, that the IDF, because Eli Yishai said this, evidence that everything that Israel did that hit civilians was all deliberately intentional. However, so this is in regard to Israel. However, when it came time to statements made by Palestinians, you see a very different standard. Let me give you two examples. One of the allegations in the Goldstone Report is that when, on the first day of the war, as you may recall, Israel, in a very spectacular fashion, bombed a Hamas police station and killed approximately 100 or so Hamas police men. And Israel said that Hamas police were part of the combatant forces against us, and they were perfectly legitimate targets under international law. Goldstone says no. They were police. Police are civilians. They're not necessarily part of the fighting forces. You have to distinguish. And so it says, the Goldstone Report says, that killing the police was a major war crime. Now, it so happens that during the hostilities, the Hamas police spokesman said the following. He said, when the enemy comes, we, the police, will stand up and confront the enemy. Evidence that the police were hardly just civilian police. They were part of the combatant forces that Israel was opposing. However, the Goldstone Report says that, you have to understand, we spoke to the Hamas police spokesman, and he told us when he said we're going to confront the enemy, he meant we're going to control traffic. It's in the report. We're going to control traffic, and then we're going to distribute foodstuffs. So that's how we're going to confront the enemy. And this is sort of taken as a serious statement. And so the initial statement that they're going to confront the enemy is excused. Another example, when Israel pointed out that on Hamas websites, many of the so-called police officers are hailed as martyrs who were part of the terrorist movements of one or another shade and were hailed as such, and had their pictures. So-and-so police officer who was actually a member of our Hamas force, Shaheed, a martyr, and this, that, and the other. And Goldstone Report says, no, you don't understand. That's puffery. That's the terrorist groups are competing one with the other. It's not the language he uses. He calls them, the word Hamas hardly appears in the report. It's called the Gaza Authorities. It's a complete whitewash, right? You wouldn't know there's a terrorist group running Hamas. The term used in the report throughout is the Gaza Authorities, not Hamas, not terrorist group, Gaza Authorities. So he says, well, these groups, these armed groups, they try to show that they have many members and so forth. So they claimed that they were members, but we shouldn't take that at face value. So when Israel, there's one member of the Israeli cabinet who's known for shooting off his mouth, says something, based on that you can indict the entire Israeli military and political leadership. But if you have Hamas policemen, websites, that's all dismissed. And that, again, is throughout the report. A few other things that appear in the report. The report looks at what Israel does in the West Bank, even though the West Bank is not Gaza, and the mandate was to look at Gaza. It alleges that Israel repressed demonstrations within Israel itself, which is ridiculous. Again, had nothing to do with Gaza. It says that it finds ways to accuse Israel of discrimination. One of the ways they look at how Israel is a Jewish state, and that can be discriminatory in certain ways, having nothing to do with the Gaza conflict. And one of the things they say is that during the Gaza conflict and leading up to it, Israel has a defense system of warning for Qassam rockets, but they only had it for Jews in Sderot and in Ashkelon, but they didn't have it for Arabs living in southern Israel. Okay? There are two things about this. Number one, the Arabs in southern Israel were never the targets of Qassams. That's number one. Number two, many of these are Bedouins who are actually moving and don't have permanent residence. But the Goldstone Report, wherever it could find a way to accuse Israel of being discriminatory, they found it. So this, in brief, is the report, a completely one-sided, egregiously one-sided, and I would say ignominious report. And people who know Richard Goldstone professionally have told me that they are deeply disappointed in the quality of his report. And people who are not known to be great supporters of Israel, and some of whom are in high places in government today, and Western governments, have told me that. So this is the report, and the myth that this report is serious, that it is credible, it is not serious, it is not credible. Any person who reads it objectively and has no agenda against Israel will reach the conclusions that I've just described. I'll say something about the mandate and then the members. Goldstone says, yes, the original mandate of the resolution of January 12th was only against Israel and presumed guilt and so forth. He says it was lopsided. But then I came on April 3rd, and I was appointed with 3 others. And I made a deal with the president of the Human Rights Council. He appointed me, and I told him I won't take it unless the mandate is changed. And I changed the mandate. And the president gave me terms of reference, which say that we can look at all violations that occurred, whether before, during, or after the conflict. And this covers both sides, and I'm going to look at both sides. And that's what he told Israel. He wrote to Israel on April 3rd. He wrote a letter, and it's in the end of his report. He annexes the correspondence he had with Israel, and he writes to the Israeli ambassador, I changed the mandate, and you should cooperate with me because it's going to be fair. I'm going to look at both sides. And Israel responded and said, well, you can't change the mandate. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand what I'm about to say, but the Human Rights Council has 47 members. They vote on resolutions. They had enacted a resolution saying there should be a fact-finding mission, look at Israel, declaring Israel guilty, and so forth. The president of the Human Rights Council is kind of like the Speaker of the Congress. He can't, Speaker of the House, he can't on his own change a resolution any more than a Speaker in Parliament can on his own change a law. You need the plenary to amend it. And the plenary of the Human Rights Council never changed the mandate. And actually there was a resolution. The resolutions at the end of the year are sent to New York. And if you look at the one that was ratified by the General Assembly a few weeks ago, you'll see that the mandate remains as it was. Goldstone made this argument that he changed the mandate. First he said the president changed it. It was pointed out that's not possible. Then he said Well, the president reported back to the plenary in June, and the plenary was silent. So their silence changed the mandate. And Ken Roth of Human Rights Watch repeated this, echoed this in an op-ed. Again, nonsense. You cannot change a resolution by silence in the Human Rights Council. Then Goldstone said, well, yes, but I spoke to the sponsors. I spoke to Cuba, and I spoke for the non-aligned movement, and Pakistan for the Islamic group, and Egypt for the Arab group, and they were okay with it. And so that's how I changed the mandate. Again, none of this, by any stretch of anyone's interpretation of UN rules, is sufficient to change a resolution. And again, formally, the GA recently issued its annual report of resolutions, and the original unchanged mandate is there. So why does all this matter? Because the reason Israel did not cooperate is they said, you're coming to us with a tainted mandate, and based on that, we are not going to cooperate with you. And really one of the themes of the Goldstone Report was to find a way to accuse Israel of war crimes, but to appear to be balanced. And that was really kind of what Goldstone tried to do. And he tried to distance himself from the Human Rights Council's resolution. He did it in a couple of ways. Again, I told you he changed the mandate. He said he changed the mandate. You know, every report by the Human Rights Council is titled Report of Fact-Finding Mission on Sudan or on Lebanon or whatever, established pursuant to resolution blah, blah, blah. And Goldstone, the first report of this kind, it deletes that. Even though he was established by this resolution, he deletes that from his thing. In fact, it's interesting. If you if you want to have some fun, if you want to read any of these documents, you can go on our website, unwatch.org, and there's a section called Goldstone Report. You can't miss it on our homepage, and you can find these documents. This is the Goldstone Report. It's marked up. When he first wrote to the Israeli ambassador, his stationery read, Human Rights Council Fact-Finding Mission, established by Resolution S91, the tainted resolution. And he signed head of the fact-finding mission established under Resolution S91. And then he came up with this strategy to erase that, to pretend that he didn't have anything to do with the Human Rights Council. Suddenly, 5 days later, it says Human Rights Council fact-finding mission, and the words established according to Resolution S91 are gone. Head of fact-finding mission, the words established under the resolution are gone. So deliberately erased those words and made other changes he also dropped the words, it was originally called Human Rights Council. A couple of weeks later, instead of being the Human Rights Council mission, it became the United Nations fact-finding mission. So Goldstone would have you believe he has nothing to do with the Human Rights Council that I described to you, 80% against Israel. He's got nothing to do with that. The resolution that created his mandate, that framed it, and to whom he reported, it was not just the providence, but also to whom he was reporting. He wanted to erase any connection with that, but of course, those were very much there. That was the provenance of his report, and when he reported back to the council, the first thing they did, despite his attempt to pretend to address both sides, was they condemned Israel and said nothing about Hamas. So much for changing the mandate. The mandate was never legally changed. Finally, a word about the members. Goldstone said the members were impartial. False. Myth. I'll tell you two things. One, all 4 members of the mission had signed a statement before they were chosen, a month before they were chosen, saying they were shocked to the core about Gaza. Okay? Richard Goldstone, Hina Gilani, Christine Chinkin, Desmond Travers, all of them had signed this public letter a month before. They had never signed a letter in 8 years of rockets saying that they were shocked about 10,000 Qassams fired against Israeli citizens. And these were the people who were chosen as impartial for this mission. Go one more on that. Christine Chinkin is a law professor in the London School of Economics, one of the members chosen. Not only did she sign that statement, but in January 11th, during the war, so a year ago today, during the war, Christine Chinkin signed a joint statement published, it was a letter, published in the Sunday Times of London. And I'm going to read you the headline. Okay, it's Christine Chinkin, effectively one of the judges in the Goldstone Report. Israel's bombardment of Gaza is not self-defense, it's a war crime. So while the war is on, she's sitting in London, hasn't been there, doesn't know what's happened on the ground. She's determined that Israel has, by the way, she argues, here, let me read you the first sentence. Israel justifies its attacks on Gaza by stating it's an act of self-defense. We categorically reject this contention. Israel cannot rely on the right of self-defense. So Israel did not have the right of self-defense in this battle. So Israel's actions were aggression, and it committed war crimes. She's chosen to be a judge where the very question is whether Israel committed war crimes in Gaza. Once again, this is not a question of a judge who might have something against one of the parties once upon a time, last year, 10 years ago, some conflict of interest. Someone who, on the very case and controversy at issue, has publicly expressed herself in the most unequivocal way, publicly in the Sunday Times, her name affixed to it, she's chosen as an impartial judge. My organization wrote a 28-page brief with a very simple proposition. You could call it overkill. You really needed maybe 3 sentences, but I used to be a lawyer, so that's what you do. So I wrote a 28-page brief. You can read it on our website. Request to disqualify Christine Schinken, and Goldstone ignored it. Only 2 months later, when the Jewish Chronicle of London went after the UN, they issued a response and they said, it's worthless. And all we said was that under international law, you're supposed to be impartial. Impartiality means being free of any commitment to a preconceived outcome. She should disqualify herself. She did not. So telling us that the members were impartial is preposterous. It was a myth. You know, and Goldstone, of course, everyone says, but Goldstone's Jewish, but he's a Zionist, but he's pro-Israel. Yes, Goldstone is Jewish. Yes, he has been affiliated with some Jewish organizations. But the notion that he's some incredibly pro-Israel guy is a myth. Goldstone was an active member of Human Rights Watch during a time when they were viciously condemning Israel and wrote a public letter defending their actions against Israel. Goldstone was interviewed on BBC Panorama in 2001 on a show designed to show that Ariel Sharon is a war criminal, and he gave quotes encouraging that kind of a show. Goldstone has been in UN circles for the past 15 years. I'm not aware of a single significant statement he has made against anti-Israel bias at the UN. In fact, when he was interviewed on Israeli TV, why didn't the UN do anything when Israelis were attacked? He said, oh, maybe it's because Israel never asked the UN. If Israel had only asked the UN, maybe they would have done something. Well, Israel actually sends letters upon letters every time there's an attack, and the UN does nothing. So this notion that Goldstone is somehow this super pro-Israel guy is really false. And those who know him personally, and I have various personal connections to him, know that that's false. But it's deliberately used to try to give credibility that is non-deserving. So much for the Goldstone Report. What's coming up next with the report? In a few weeks, we'll have the Secretary General of the UN will issue his progress report, a report card, and once again the debate will arise anew. It is already being used in places like England to fuel what we call lawfare, warfare by other means, to prosecute Israelis. Israelis can no longer visit London. Those who are political leaders or military officers under threat of being prosecuted for war crimes. And the Goldstone Report fuels all of that. He calls on, in his report, countries to exercise jurisdiction and prosecute the war criminals that he describes. So this issue is very much going to be with us in the year ahead, and it's not pretty. And it's not pretty. UN Watch has tried to do what we can on these issues. We brought Richard Kemp, Colonel Richard Kemp, of the commander of British forces in Afghanistan. He served with NATO, he served with the UN, he served with the American Army in the Gulf War #1. And he said, someone who's been with every army of importance in the Western world and has fought with them, and he said, he told the UN, speaking on our behalf on October 16th, he said, in the history of warfare, no military has done more to prevent harm to civilians than the Israel Defense Forces did during Operation Cast Lead. And that video has now been seen hundreds of thousands of times around the world, quoted in the New York Times and elsewhere. So we're trying to be outspoken on these issues, but it's hard. These are all symptoms of an attempt to demonize Israel, to delegitimize Israel. I don't know what Richard Goldstone thought in his head, but he has fueled this movement. The Goldstone Report is very much alive. We'll be seeing it on many fronts. It'll be at a campus near you. It may be at a court near you. It's not going away. It'll be there for years to come. And it is an instance, just one instance of many at the UN, unfortunately, where the human rights tradition of Eleanor Roosevelt, the founding principles of the UN, are distorted and used against Israel. This is very much an uphill battle, to bring the UN back to its founding principles, to bring human rights back to their founding principles. But I think what happened at Durban 2 shows that sometimes we can make a difference, that sometimes the people who care about human rights, who really care about human rights. If we're organized, if we're unified, and if we're clever, we can make a difference. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.